today, or today's message, our hope for that we would begin the process of, of making room for Christ. My parents came and visited us for Thanksgiving, and this was the image as we were singing this song. This is kind of what came to mind was as they were coming, before they came, we had to make room for them. We had to get stuff out of the closet that we had been storing in our guest bedroom closet, clear it out to make sure that the room was ready. We needed to literally make room for them to celebrate time of Thanksgiving. And as we enter into this season, who are we making room for, and what are we making room for? Not just in a season of celebration, but in our hearts. And so we hope this morning to kind of just prepare our hearts a little bit for this season. We're in an in-between. This is an in-between message. So we just finished a series of practicing the Psalms, where we were encouraged to actually take what was being done in the Psalms and apply it in our lives. And next week we'll be starting this series, officially starting the series, The Way in a Manger. And so we've got this gap Sunday, and it's a great season because historically the first candle of Advent that we heard is recognizing the 400 years of silence. So I thought in the spirit of practicing, we would just be quiet for the whole service. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. No, we're gonna jump into kind of an in-between message that hopefully makes room for us. So we're gonna do two things today. First half is we're gonna look at the context of Christmas, context of the first Christmas, and then the first words of Christmas. So we're gonna kind of look at two different aspects of this, and I want to start by, and we kind of talked about it this morning already. Where does the Christmas story start? It starts in silence. The people of Israel had been waiting for 400 years. There had been no prophet. In the pattern in the Old Testament was that the people of Israel, there would be prophets that were spokespeople from God. If you think of it that way, they were the ones that would receive a message from God and tell the people of God what God is saying. It was an intermediate that they had, and for years they had this intermediate. Some of these prophets were good, some of these prophets weren't so good, but there was God speaking through to his people through prophets. And that stopped. And so for 400 years, the people of Israel were waiting for something from God. There was a sense of silence, and it's important as we enter into this making room time to remember the context of the first Christmas. It was a time of, wait a second, we've been waiting. It's one thing to wait for a short period of time. It's another thing to be waiting for a long period of time. The context was one of probably multiple disappointments over time, multiple generations of waiting and longing. God, when are you going to do what you said? When are you going to show up? When is that going to happen? And living a whole life, and not just one generation's life, but another generation's life. If it goes on long enough, which 400 years is pretty long, you begin to question, is it true? Is it real? Can he be trusted? What's wrong with me? Maybe there's something wrong with us. And so what do we do in that sense of waiting? There were some who said, hey, we're going to go do our own thing. And there was others at the time that went off and said, hey, we're going to kind of create a faux faith, a fake faith, because we can't handle this waiting, this in between. I think it's as we move into this season, it's important to start there, to start and actually put ourselves in the spot of these early, the people of Israel at this time, the people who had been waiting, and to start feeling that. It's important to feel and to imagine what would be like, because if you're like me, we can, at least at different parts of our life, relate to some sense of, God, will you just show up? Or maybe, I don't know if I can trust you anymore. What are we to do? And just to start there. So I'm going to start with the actual, to get there, is to look back at the last words before the 400 years. So sometimes it's important to look back before we look forward. And the last words were in the book of Malachi. And there was a promise and an instruction that I think is important for us as we look at this waiting period of time of what to do. And here it is. It's in Malachi 4. And it's an interesting passage because it's most of the passage is about destruction. That how God's going to come back and these people have been waiting. And it starts in Malachi verse 2. It says, "But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays. And you will go out and jump for joy like well-fed calves. And you will trample the wicked and their ashes, and they will be ashes under the soles of your feet on the day that I act." See, in his last words, it's important what is being said here, because Christ or God is through his prophet Malachi is saying, hey, there is hope. That there is hope for healing. That healing will come. That freedom will come. And that there will be justice. You will be honored. In that, in us, at least in so much of my story, God, would healing come? Where does we see us searching for healing so much in us. We try to fill that in our own soul, and here we see this promise of, no, remember, the Son of Righteousness will rise, and healing is in its rays. The healing will come. And you'll go out and you will be free. You will be full of joy. Imagine little calves jumping on the hillside. That's the picture of freedom, of joy. We have 2-year-old kids, and it's fun to see that. Just this morning, Luke was just running around in circles, just pure joy. I have no idea why. Absolutely no idea why. I mean, it usually goes in between joy and like other terror. I mean, there's that side of it. But you get a glimpse here of that picture of pure joy. That healing is coming, that joy will be there, and that justice will be done. That God will make things right. So he reminds the people of Israel of this promise that's not new. These 3 things is not new to a new promise that he's giving. It's actually an ancient promise that we see throughout the biblical narrative. And then he goes and he says, he changes tones and he says, remember. I think in this context, that God knew that there was going to be a time of silence that was going to be coming. And as we go into a time of waiting, I think he says this here to say, hold on to this, remember this. It's a bit of a, hey, you know this before, but I want you to remember something. And he says, remember the law of my servant Moses, and the decrees and the laws I gave him in Israel. He's saying, don't forget the stories of what got you here today. See, it's so easy to forget what God has done. And he's saying, hey, remember, be steadfast in your faith. Tell the stories one to another. Tell the laws, the ways in which God is to interact with us and we're to interact with him. Tell that to the next generation, to the next generation. Something happens when we remember. And his invitation here is one of remembering and being steadfast in our hope. Steadfast in the relationship. It's in the silence, it's in the waiting oftentimes that can be challenged. And that can be just yeah, we can begin to question the validity of that hope. But he says to be steadfast, to remember, to tell the stories. Because over 400 years later, we see that the stories were being told. This hope, this holding on to the promises was still being held out. And how is it being held out? Because people were remembering to tell the stories, to pass it on to the next generation and to the next generation. And in this waiting, God is doing something. He's doing something in us, and he's doing something through us, and he's doing something for us in this waiting.
But sometimes God just seems really, really quiet. I don't know if you've ever had seasons like that, seasons where God seems quiet, where your life seems quiet, where there's just a time of deep longing and searching, and maybe you're not even quite sure what you're waiting for, but there's a hunger, a darkness, a time of just not understanding what God is up to, and where we just can't see it. And we find the Israelites in that time of those 400 years just trusting that God must have been up to something, but they couldn't see it. We have no written record of what God was doing for 400 years. That seems really crazy to us now, that we don't even know who God's mouthpiece was then, what God was doing to continue his long story that he was writing. But we obviously get to the point in Matthew chapter 1 where it starts to make sense, where God starts to speak, where the waiting comes to fruition, that they can start to see that God was working all that time, where they were faithful to pass along the stories, and they find themselves those 400 years later still knowing, still trusting that God's promises were going to be fulfilled. Somehow they still held on to that hope. And if you, like me, like Paul, have had times of long seasons of waiting, of quiet, of wondering, then you know the kind of questions that come up in those times. The classic, how long, O Lord? How long, O Lord? Will you forget me? Will you hide your face from me? Or just the, what am I doing wrong? Like you said, what have I heard you wrong? Is there something in me that is making the waiting last longer? Is there something I can do? Is there something I should do? Or even the question of, should I just give up hoping altogether? Maybe I didn't hear God right. Maybe I'm the one that's in the wrong, and I should be the one to just give up hope, to trust God for something else, and to let go of this. I have certainly been there. As I've shared before up here, I longed to be married for many, many years. We didn't meet and get married until I was 40, and then had our twin boys a year later. But I would have loved to be married by 25. And so I had 15 years of, God, what are you doing? And have I heard you wrong? And what can I do? Or maybe I should just give up hope. And I really came to a point, just kind of a crossroads of, maybe it would be easier to stop hoping and to just kind of let God off the hook on this one, and that maybe marriage isn't what he has for me, that a family isn't what he has for me, and maybe I can shift my hope elsewhere and trust God's faithfulness somewhere else. And yet, somehow in that time, instead of giving up hope, God really invited me to hold on even tighter to hope, and to hold on to him as capital H hope. He is our hope. To hold on to him, but to hold on, to not quit hoping, to not quit trusting that God keeps his promises. And a phrase that came to me a lot in that time was, this will make more sense one day. This will make more sense one day. And maybe that's what you need for right now even. But the questions I asked of why the waiting, why would God put something in my heart that he didn't intend to fulfill? Is he withholding from me? Is this the kind of God that I serve that isn't wanting me to be a mom, a wife? Why would he seem to promise something and not fulfill it for that long period of time for me? And I remember reading in the stories in Genesis of how God promised to Abraham and Sarah 25 years before he actually fulfilled with Isaac that they would be parents, that they would have a child. And I just started to wonder, okay, what would God's purpose be in promising something 25 years before he intended to give it? Why couldn't he just tell them, like, year 24, like, hey, next year, this will come to pass? But no, God actually intended to give them a promise to hold on to for 25 years. And even on a shallower side, why do we look forward to Christmas for, some of us start looking forward in September, October, when Halloween rolls around. Some of us even just this month before Christmas. Why do we build up all of this anticipation for something that isn't here yet? Why don't we just celebrate, Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, move on with it? But there is a purpose in the long wait, in the anticipation and the stirring up. And the 400 years of silence are certainly a huge picture of that there was the anticipation building, and even the invitation from the Lord to ask, why would he put something in our hearts? Why would he plant this notion of the Messiah for all these years and not begin to fulfill it for many, many years later? We know that God doesn't play games. We know that God doesn't hold a carrot out to tempt us or to make us walk too fast in front, but that he doesn't withhold from us. He doesn't try to just teach us a lesson. So what might God be up to in those long periods of silence, in the waiting, when we know something is coming? I wrote this poem as a possible attempt to just explore some of the ideas of why we might be in seasons of waiting. I wrote this actually just a couple weeks before I met Paul and was starting to kind of grasp why God had me in this long quiet, why there might be, what he might have been up to in the meantime. And I wrote it as questions, not to have answers, but to just explore the possibilities of what God might be up to in the meantime. And so if you're in a season of waiting and longing, or just dark, bleary, or just anticipation of something is coming, something is going to change, but it's not there yet, then this poem is for you. I have a collection of Advent poems, and if you would like one, I have a few to pass out, so you can come see me afterwards. But this is a poem for those who wait. May it be just an invitation to be curious about what God might be up to in the middle. What if the seemingly endless delay is full of gifts you wouldn't receive any other way? What if walking in the wilderness is the point? What if waiting in the stillness is the joy? What if the roots need to burrow down deeper so the fruit will be just that much sweeter? What if the waiting makes the heart grow stronger, just as absence makes the heart grow fonder? What if it's less about getting to the other side and more about the slow transformation taking place deep inside? What if the best things don't happen overnight and time is actually on your side? What if you really, truly are not in control and all you can do is let it unfold? What if God hasn't forgotten his plans for you? He's simply inviting you to lean in and pay close attention to what he is about to do. What if when it seems like nothing is happening at all, that's right when God is saying, I am still faithful? What if it looks really different than you thought it would? But even then, it could still be really, really good. May it be so.
We live in a world that of instant gratification, of where, I can order something on Amazon here in Columbus and get something, within that afternoon in some cases. We haven't been accustomed to waiting. But in the waiting, something does happen. In the waiting, in that silence, we are confronted with our fears. We're confronted with I have been confronted with my powerlessness to change a certain situation, to not, have the solution, to not have the answers. And that is extremely vulnerable. It's extremely uncomfortable. Oftentimes when you look at trauma, there's this sense of when we feel like, hey, there's a lot, it's usually rooted in some type of powerlessness and some type of hopelessness and some type of, lack of voice to be able to move or to experience freedom. And while this isn't traumatic, there is an element of in the waiting that exposes our powerlessness. It exposes our hopelessness. It exposes our inability to show up in the ways that oftentimes we hope to. And it's in that vulnerability and it's in that place that oftentimes God does meet us the most, because we've made room for him. We aren't showing up strong. We aren't showing up with all the right answers. We aren't showing up with all the right words to express. We're showing up with all of ourselves and everything that's in us. And that is a place in my life when I got to those places where I acknowledged that, where I sat in the waiting, not fighting it, but sitting in it, that I began to see that God was at work. So eventually God does speak. Eventually in the story, there isn't just an ongoing 400 years of silence. There is a time that God enters the scene. The silence breaks. And if you are going to break 400 years of silence, what would you say? What would you do? Who would you tell? I mean, I think of a lot of different things that I would say if, I would do it. Would you want to have this huge parade? Make sure everybody knows. Would you would plan it out very specifically. You would plan it out you've had 400 years to plan this, of how I'm going to break the silence of this waiting. And it's very interesting to me. And it pops out of, in God's perfect intentionality, what he says. The first words. And there's various characters, from a guy named Zechariah, who was a priest, who had been waiting his whole life based on this promise that he would be welcoming in part of that re-entrance of Christ's Messiah to come. There was a guy named Joseph that was a carpenter. There was Mary, this young woman. And there was also this group of shepherds that we begin to see God breaking the silence in it. And I want to turn, if you have your Bibles, you can turn, or you can just read, or you can just try to remember Charlie Brown's Christmas, because he says it in there. In this waiting, the first works says, and there were shepherds living out in the fields nearby. Are you familiar with this? Can you picture that? If you we just watched Charlie Brown's Christmas the other night, so I'm picturing, them saying this. There there were shepherds living out their fields nearby, keeping watch over their flocks at night, and the angel of the Lord appeared to them. And the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were terrified. But the angel said to them, "Do not be afraid." That's the same words, "do not be afraid," that Zechariah was told. It's the same words that Joseph was told. It was the same words that Mary was told when God is breaking his silence. See, the first thing that we see here, and he keeps going, "Do not be afraid, for I will bring you good news that will cause great joy for all people. Today in the town of David, a Savior has been born to you, and he is the Messiah. He is the Lord." And then he goes on and says, "This will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in clothes, lying in a manger." And suddenly a great company of heavenly hosts appeared to the angel, praising God and saying, "Glory to God in the highest. Glory to God in the highest heaven, and peace on earth to those whom his favor rests." So, and then it kind of kicks off the rest of the story of the Christmas narrative that we'll walk through over the next couple weeks. But I want to focus in on the "do not be afraid." The context was a context of silence, and the first words that he says is "do not be afraid." God is acknowledging first, he confronts our own shames, our own disappointments, our own doubts, and he enters in by saying, hey, not saying, hey, you guys shouldn't have been having all of that. He comes in and he says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. You know, if you've been in a season, as we've talked about this waiting, there are so many different things that when it actually comes, it can be scary. When change comes, it can be scary. And we think about, wow, are we really good enough to see this? I imagine those shepherds being like, wait a second. Maybe God's coming to, like, if he's showing up, man, I'm condemned here. And something's going to happen to me because I haven't lived up to all the things that I should have been doing. Or whatever it is, the first thing he does, he confronts our shames, our disappointments, our doubt, because fear finds its roots so often in these things. The second thing that we see him doing in this first thing is he simply lets them know that he sees them and that they are heard. In some of the other ones, I've heard your cry is what he says to Zechariah. He says, I've heard it. I've seen it. To the shepherds, these lowly, these commoners, these everyday people, these aren't the kings, the most important people, the most religious people of the day. These are just the common folk. Probably they might not have been going and doing all this stuff. They probably weren't doing all the stuff that they were supposed to do, or at least if they were doing the bare minimum. They were just your everyday person, and God comes in and says, I see you too, that this joy that will be for all people is being demonstrated in who he says this first message to, who he breaks the silence with, reiterates that point and makes that point clear that this is for all people. I see you too. In our waiting, we can feel like God doesn't see us, that we have been forgotten, that we have been overlooked. And in his return, he reminds us in a beautiful, intentional way, don't be afraid. I see you. I'm here, that I am bringing great news, this news of healing, this news of freedom, this news of justice, of making things right in our world. This news is for all people, even the commoner, like the shepherd, even the foreigner that we see in chapters later, as in the Magi that are coming in, even a young woman who isn't quite doesn't have everything together, or a carpenter's son, or a priest that's been waiting his whole life, trying to hold on to do what is right. In that waiting, he says, I see you. Don't be afraid. Change is coming.
So do not be afraid. The first words that broke the silence of 400 years, and not just once, but 4 times, that the people needed to hear that over and over and over again. The waiting is over, and God is now on the move in ways that we can see. He was always on the move in those years of quiet, always, always working, and yet now he's working. He's beginning to work in ways that they will be able to see. And there's this beautiful invitation, not to go and do something immediately, but actually to receive this gift of not being afraid. That is the first words. It's time, you're ready. That's how I picture the words coming to these different people is, okay, it's time. Like when there's been a long hush or even, on Christmas Eve, just this, it's ready. We're ready. It's time to prepare, and you are able to receive it. And this can sometimes take us really off guard. I think parts of why the do not be afraid phrase came to that first group of people when God began to fulfill was because it was a surprise. Even though they were waiting and longing for all those years, it could still take them really off guard and kind of turn everything upside down. Because even when God begins to fulfill, there is so much change, so much transition. There is a jarring, kind of surprising feeling of just this. I was kind of getting used to the waiting. I was just settled into this long quiet. And now everything is about to be different. And fear, we know that is just an automatic emotional response. We have fight or flight. We have this automatic response that comes to us. So I don't believe that God is saying in these words, do not be afraid, like to turn off that emotion. I don't think we can turn off that emotion of fear, but actually to not live in fear, to not wallow or to not be taken in by fear, to not let anxiety and doubt and all the questions that we've been asking in the waiting, to not let those overcome, but actually to live in the opposite of fear, which is trust, to live in that rest and trust that God is truly fulfilling what I've been waiting and longing and praying for. And I love this idea that the more we anticipate something, we prepare for it. There's a correlation between our anticipation of the thing and our preparation of the thing. Think about, for those of us who have had children, we anticipate so much this new child that we prepare so much. We anticipate for a marriage, that we prepare so much. There is this, if we don't anticipate something, we won't prepare for it very much. But since we anticipate, even Christmas, we anticipate, that means there is an equal kind of preparation for that anticipation. And so God here is stirring up that anticipation, that expectation, and saying, also, prepare, get ready, make room. This is the time to be ignited, to be stirred up, and to let God expand your heart to make room for him there. So I wrote this poem called Do Not Be Afraid, those first 4 words that broke 400 years of silence. I wrote this for those of us who can live in anxiety, can live in questioning and wondering, that allow the doubts and the shame to sometimes overtake, and who might have a hard time receiving the do not be afraid. And also for those of us who, when change comes, when the breaking of the silence, or when the transition, when the new thing is actually upon us, because guess what? God does actually keep his promises. And when that comes, to trust that God knows that you're ready. When there is the gift of the new thing, the restoration, it's time. He's here. This is happening, that you are ready. And so this is an invitation for those of us that are facing perhaps even soon a change, a transition, whether it's a gift and a good thing or a difficult thing. It is something different, and God is on the move in a different way. So do not be afraid. Is it any wonder? The first words the angels always say before announcing news of a transition, before proclaiming a great change, is, do not be afraid. To Zechariah, for years you have waited, with tears you have prayed. Today the Lord has seen and heard. You will have a child in your old age, and nothing will ever be the same. But do not be afraid. To Mary, the Lord your God is with you, O highly favored one. Though you are a virgin, young and poor, the Savior of the world will be your son, and nothing will ever be the same. But do not be afraid. To Joseph, you're about to be a first-time father. You'll soon begin a new life. You are to take this unwed teen mother, a scandal, to raise this child together as your wife. And nothing will ever be the same. But do not be afraid. To the shepherds, today you will see the glory of God and hear the angels sing good news. Now go, make known this wonder, for God has especially commissioned you, and nothing will ever be the same. But do not be afraid. And to you who are facing a big transition, or making a life-changing decision, or going an entirely new direction, when everything is about to change and nothing will ever be the same, dear one, do not be afraid. We will be taking communion together here in a moment. And this is a practice, as we've been, thank you, Isaac, as we've been in this series of practicing the Psalms, we are continuing to practice the story of God's faithfulness. The reason we can not be afraid as we enter a new season, a transition, a decision, the reason we do not have to be afraid, that God invites us not to be afraid, is because he always keeps his promises, that God is the faithful one. And we tell that story over and over and over again. I just think about those 400 years, I don't know how many generations that would have been, but without a formal prophet and without the word of God written, there was still the carrying on of the story of God, so much so that the people 400 years later were still anticipating a Messiah. And the only way that could have happened is because they told their children, and their children told their children, and their children told their children. They repeated the fact that God was faithful and God would do it again. He's been faithful in the past. He will be faithful in the future. And even though we might not get to see it, he will keep his promises. And so as we participate in communion, we do this every month. Some churches do it every week. Sometimes we just need that frequent practice, this embodiment of our over and over again expressing this hope that we have. Yes, Jesus has come and Jesus will come again. He is here and we are longing for him to come, and we know that that day will come. And we will keep doing that until that great and glorious day where we see the Lord face to face. This is a practice that we will not forget to do. For all the generations that have come since Christ, we are still doing this. Just on the last night that before Jesus went to the cross, on the night before he was betrayed, he began this tradition, this practice, and we continue in this act of trust to keep putting our hope in God, to keep saying, we trust you now, we trusted you then. Maybe even today is an invitation to tell a story to someone of God's faithfulness, to keep practicing in our words the fact that God has kept his promises, and we have seen it and we will see it again.